This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 389 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today, it's all about how travel transforms our thinking. Firstly, let me pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation where I'm recording this podcast. We are just entering the Noongar season of Djeran, which is finally the end of extreme heat and having some cooler nights. It's my favourite time of the year, really. This morning, though, we actually have even had rain and thunder. Enough thunder, I actually had to wait for a while before recording because it was too loud. I'm not complaining. It's nice to see a little bit of rain here. It's been a very dry spell. Now, back to how travel transforms our thinking. My own experiences of travel have definitely constantly and just many, many times transformed and reframed how I think about the world. And above all, traveling almost always reminds me there's no black and white. There's no, like many ideas or even facts and histories that I think are very clear are much more often nuanced and multi-sided and, need a lot more deeper thinking. For example, I think on previous episodes over the years, I would have mentioned the year I spent living in Slovakia teaching business English when I had so many interesting discussions there with my students. So it was the early 2000s, not all that long after the Iron Curtain fell. So they taught me so much about what it had actually been like to live there in socialist times. Some things were better, some things were worse. One of my favorite students, Bobby, always used to tell me, he always liked to get off track and not do the grammar lessons. So he knew this was a great topic to discuss with me because I'd always want to know more. And so Bobby used to say to me, yes, everybody was equal under socialism, but if you knew the right people, you were a little bit more equal. I learned so much from them, and it certainly wasn't the clear that it was not capitalism is better narrative that, we'd been taught in high school history classes. So always so much to learn. Now, my first guest today who has some thoughts on this topic too is Nikki Padilla Rivera, and she starts off by telling me some preconceived ideas she had before visiting Vietnam for the first time.
When I went to Asia for the first time, it was a really big trip. I'm a U.S. American. I'm from New York. So Asia is like a very big trip for us. And I went for work and I was there for like a month. I started in Vietnam and I did Thailand, which was wild. My family couldn't believe it. And I, in New York City, I love Chinatown, love Chinese food, love Chinese people, the culture. That was my real big connection, and Japanese culture as well. I was around a lot here. And so very incorrectly, when I went to Vietnam, I was like, it'll just be like Chinatown. It'll be like a big Chinatown because it's Asia. And I went and I was obviously dead wrong. I just had these preconceived notions of what it would be. I was very positive and excited to go, but it was all looking back like these negative things like, oh, well, it's going to be really crowded and people are going to be very assertive and it's going to be very pushy. But then I go to Vietnam and the fashion is amazing. They're all wearing these beautiful, cute dresses and, their little heels, their little red lipstick on the back of their bikes. They are, because I spent time with our local team there at the time we were for Intrepid Travel. So they have a huge Vietnam office in Hanoi. And they were sassy. Those women were cracking jokes and, breaking each other's balls. And it was so different than what I had imagined. And it really, it really kind of opened my eyes up of, obviously it's not a monolith. I was someone working in travel and I was like, it's going to be like Chinatown. That was really eye-opening for me as a trip. And you do not know until you're there and amongst the people and the culture, you actually have no idea.
I think that's probably a very, very common experience that we, lump a bunch of places together based on our limited experiences at home and have expectations that are completely shattered. And it's a very good lesson, isn't it? That changes how you think forever.
So good. And Vietnam is to this day probably my favorite place on earth. I love it. If I could only go to one place ever again, I would go back to Vietnam every time.
Fabulous. Oh, yeah. I love that. It's a very good lesson in life, isn't it? Can happen to all of us. I think I have those kind of preconceived notions about Central and South America because, I have limited experience of it here. I've met a few Colombians and Brazilians. That's about it. I still honestly would stereotype all of them to say they're very outgoing, friendly people, like full stop. And I'm sure that, there's so many more nuances across, like that's a vast region that I have just stereotyped by my very limited experiences.
That's so true. That's actually a really good example. I'm Puerto Rican and I also hold that. I'm like, yeah, Guatemalan, Salvadorians, like they're kind of similar. It's probably not the case at all.
But it's human nature. We've got to try and make order of the world. And so it's probably just human nature to box things until we know better. But it's good to remember that we don't know, I think. And I find Cuba a very fascinating destination, also somewhere I've never been. What did you learn when you went to Cuba?
Oh man, Cuba was wild. Talking about preconceived notions. So my family's from Puerto Rico. I married a Puerto Rican. I'm there a lot. So I had this preconceived notion of, Cuba, it will be very similar to Puerto Rico in the food, in the language, in the music they listen to. I also knew that relations were awkward between the U.S. and Cuba, to say the least. Like, I was generally aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis and all these things that my parents' generation are much fresher on. We don't really discuss in school here. But then I go and I'm on this trip, and it's a trip for Americans because you cannot go to Cuba, right? So it was a very special trip only for U.S. Americans. And there are all these restrictions around it. And I was there for work. Through Intrepid, they run trips to Cuba. And so they had the special license, but it requires you have to have a U.S. employee on the trip. So I was there as like the U.S. chaperone to make sure Cubans weren't radicalizing anyone. I don't know exactly why you needed that, but that was like part of the license.
Yeah.
So we're there. It's already this really weird, veiled, like layered situation. And it happened to be that group was half boomers, so my parents' generation, and then half millennials, my generation, with those knowledge bases.
Wow.
Which I wasn't aware of before, right? So everything about that trip, I land and I was just like, my first thought was like, I'm in a communist country. Like it felt like so intense. And I was hyper aware of like, these are communist people and those are communist police people. And it wasn't something I thought about before I landed there. And I was just so hyper aware. And then, we couldn't stay in hotels as US Americans because that is providing money to the Cuba government. So we can only stay in homestay. There was like all these really weird rules that were very political. And so we're in people's homes. And I just remember we would learn all these things. And, the tour guide was phenomenal. You could tell he was like, you need to understand all of this. And we only have so much time this week. So I'm just going to keep talking at you. And so we'd be on that bus for stretches every day, going from one place to another. And he'd just be talking and talking. And he would just drop these things and be like, well, and this happened and this clearly isn't fair. He would say it in a very diplomatic way. I can't think of any example. But he would say something that to me felt so outrageous. Even that we still have an embargo against Cuba. Like it so greatly affects Cuba. And who cares? Like no one even thinks about Cuba. I just remember hearing those things on the bus. And I'd be like, what? Like this is so crazy. And what? But then the boomers on that bus would be like, well, but yeah, because, and they had all of this, not propaganda, but the press of the time without context. And they grew up in the 70s and they had a very different context. It was so interesting how willing we were to the younger group were to believe, this like young communist guy. We're like, yeah, communism, like the US is the worst. And these boomers went into it as much more like, well, you're not taking into consideration all the facts. And so that trip just really, I don't know, it was so unique. It blew my mind. Life lessons that you get from trips or things that you keep with you from trips. From that one, it was like, oh, I know nothing. Like I know nothing. And there's a lot more context that I will never know potentially.
Yeah, I think that's a great lesson. I know nothing is probably a good way to go into many situations in life, but especially those when we're traveling and learning about other people, history, cultures, etc. And especially that you can learn from also other people you're traveling with. It's not just the people you meet. So that was a really interesting thing to hear about. I also was reminded when Nikki was talking about Vietnam of a tour guide I met in Vietnam quite some years ago. And after a few days of traveling together and having, lots of interesting chats, he said, hey, I have to tell you more about my country. Vietnam is way more communist than you think and nobody knows. You've got to go home and tell people. And that was, another perspective that I wouldn't have thought of. I think especially a country like Vietnam, our vision these days as travellers is it's a delightful place for an interesting tropical holiday with great culture and food, and we don't really think beyond this to what locals are experiencing. So that was another interesting perspective. Speaking of Vietnam, my next guest is Tom Sykes, and he also discusses travelling through Southeast Asia.
I mean, I think almost every meaningful travel experience I've had has changed me, which is sort of why I do it. But I think probably the most notable one, or the most radical one, was the first time that I went out of the global north, and it was like a lot of bozos my generation. I did the backpacking in Southeast Asia. And I think, again, looking back with hindsight, you see more of the rougher edges or the sort of problematic aspects of that, which weren't so obvious at the time. And at the time, I was just very grateful to be learning about the reality of the rest of the world, that there are not only extraordinary aspects of culture and nature that you don't have access to in cold, rainy England, In other words, sort of, beautiful beaches and mountains and volcanoes and, as I say, natural features. Yes, you can see a million photos or you can watch documentaries about, but there's nothing quite like that embodied experience of engaging all your senses and being in that place, standing on that mountain, or, that's why we travel. It goes to the heart, why anyone travels, I suppose. But also kind of cultural, seeing wonders of the world, seeing places like Prambanan in Indonesia and Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and then sort of contrasting that with what was going on in Europe at that time, which was not nearly as interesting culturally and as advanced. And then that kind of, in turn, sort of challenging a lot of the sort of, Western supremacist kind of assumptions that you're fed with as someone brought up in the West, this idea that the West has always been kind of civilizationally superior and, which is clearly nonsense. I guess I'd sort of, in a second-hand way, I'd studied the history of Asia and I'd been a student of that part of the world. And there was a certain amount of knowledge I could gain from books in that, as I say, through doing sort of homework, but doing, as it were, the legwork of actually traveling physically to these places and experiencing them up close and personal was hugely eye-opening. And I think also coming back from that almost year of travel into the West, the North, whatever you want to call it, then fills you with lots of questions about what do we mean by a concept like poverty when you've seen the kind of extreme poverty in places like, in an Indian city or a major Southeast Asian metropolis. That definition is very different to the definition of poverty we have in the welfare states, even though they're all crumbling at the moment, of sort of Western Europe, for example. I think the United States is slightly different. I mean, I'm always shocked. I was in the US quite recently. I was always shocked at, and continue to be shocked at, the kind of level of homelessness and desperation and people clearly with sort of health issues, mental and physical, just out fending for themselves, on the street. That any division between the first world and the third world, or the global north and global south, starts to kind of to break down, doesn't it? When you witness that kind of stuff in the global north. And of course, there's extraordinary prosperity in the global south. And again, that's a funny experience to have. And that kind of changed me and made me, I think, thinking about the world change, was to be a relatively privileged person on this kind of backpackers circuit where you'd see the same mostly white faces in the next city or the next stop on that kind of, the big peninsula, especially peninsular Southeast Asia. And you'd realize that you were all, even though you were spending not much money at all by Western standards, you were still living like kings and queens compared to the local people. And then you'd start to see a certain kind of, and I think looking back again, I was writing about this for the book, and the benefit of hindsight is that you can make some of that kind of privilege seems a lot more problematic today than it did to me as a young bozo, as I say, who was very much part of that and complicit in it. The fact that you would come in and, just by eating a kind of a halfway decent meal in a small village, that would probably be a cause of envy from a lot of people a lot of local people who probably couldn't afford that. It would take them a month to save up for that slap-up dinner you've just bought in some backpackers hostel, So that kind of, in all sorts of ways, it opened my eyes to the kind of wonders of the world beyond a particular kind of landscape and culture that I've grown up with in England and Europe. but it also it kind of wised me up to a lot of aspects of sort of geopolitics and made me think more in sort of global terms about culture and society and values and ideologies, which I think has stayed with me, and it's sort of informed my academic work, and it's definitely informed my writing, and it's informed my attitudes. When I hear some debate in England about immigration, I kind of think, well, I want to say to some of these people, like, have you been to any of these places where people come from?
Exactly.
And would you not do the same if you were in that situation? And maybe actually go there and have that experience rather than sort of read some propaganda about it.
Yeah, again, so much that we can learn, and that the biggest lesson is, hey, I need to think more broadly and not rely on what I grew up learning or what I only hear at home. Tom mentioned a bunch of terms like the global north versus the global south, west or not west, first world, third world. I think his mixing them constantly was a good highlight of the fact that we don't really have a good term for this anymore. And definitely, he didn't use this, but developing versus developed is a pair of terms that should be completely deleted from our vocabulary these days. It's a very colonial way to try and make it seem that more economically developed countries are somehow better, when that's definitely not necessarily so. Anyway, this whole kind of, how do we even discuss these things and not knowing the best words? I think that's another thing that makes us realize it's travel that helps us reframe these and helps us understand that everything, every place, every people has their own individual pros, cons, histories, cultures, perspectives, and lots of food for thought. Now, my final guest today, we move on to Africa. James Ward has spent a lifetime visiting many, many parts of Africa, and this experience has taught him and his family a lot.
I love travel. Travel has changed me since my first trip. Now, my background, my mother's from Scotland, so I was almost born with a passport in my hand. Obviously, we go visit family and friends in Scotland a lot. And growing up where I grew up, not many people, especially at the age that I was, had done international travel. And you just had a different perspective, right? Just seeing that culture even at a young age and how different it was from being in the U.S. or the Northeast. And then we had our first trip to Africa when I was 15 years old. And that's when I fell in love with the wildlife and conservation-based trips. Again, it's the perspective. And that's the word I'll always come back to with anyone I talk to about what travel does for you. Seeing communities that are different, that people, in a lot of times I can visit communities that relatively have nothing, but yet people are happy, living an unbelievable life. And it says, okay, here's perspective. We were lucky enough to bring my daughters to Zambia on a trip, and we told them, we're not just going, you have to do something. So they collected school supplies and soccer equipment, and we brought them to a school. And before we went into the classroom and met the kids, we sat with the headmaster and some of the teachers, and they were asking questions. And on the way to the school, we drove through 2 dried up riverbeds. And the kids were asked, how far did the kids come from? And they said, past the second dried up riverbed. And I said, well, how do they get here? And I said, they walk. They have to, walk. It's like 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers. And someone said, well, we're in the dry season. That dried up riverbed isn't dried up all the time. I said, well, what happens when there's water in there? They said, well, they have to wade. And then one of my daughters put together, the Luangwa River has a lot of crocodiles and hippos, but they can easily come up. So ask the question about, what do they do with crocodiles and hippos? And the answer was wade carefully. And fast forward, we're now home. And my oldest daughter, we were at the dinner table and she started complaining about something, probably her cell phone, right? And my middle daughter said to her, Cameron, how does that compare to the kids who have to wade through crocodile-infested water to get to school? And she did the hand of the, like the weight, right? And I thought my oldest daughter was going to reach across the table and hit her. And she actually looked at her and said, you know what, you're right. And that was the end of the conversation.
Wow.
And that really sunk in with me and my wife on perspective. And, we have a common saying in our household that's first world problems, and our kids understand what that means. And I see all of our travelers that we work with, that is what I tell them. That's the special thing. You get that perspective.
This is such a lovely example of things that kids can learn from travel as well. It's just a simple thing, but a reminder that at any age, we can definitely learn to appreciate multiple perspectives. Also, my extra 2 cents on the kind of some thoughtful travel aspects here. James and his family mentioned taking donations of soccer equipment and stuff to a school, visiting its students and stuff. This is something I do think we need to be wary about, just anyone going to do this. So bear in mind that James has been leading trips in Zambia for decades, has lots of contacts, and would have been able to ascertain an actual need for this, not just show up and say, here we are to save the day. So I just love hearing all of these stories because they just are really good reminders. We never really know what's going on anywhere, even when we visit, but the more we can talk to people and learn and remember to think with a really open mind and understanding that there are so many perspectives to something that perhaps growing up we were taught was black and white. I think that's a really, really valuable part of travel. So thank you so much for listening to episode 389 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. A huge shout out to my wonderful guests. I started it off chatting with Nikki Padilla Rivera. You might remember Nikki from our International Women's Day episode because she is running She Shapes History tours in New York City. So do go to sheshapeshistory.com/NYC if you are in New York or headed there, and please go on one of their tours. I then chatted with Tom Sykes. You can find out more about Tom from his website, tomgsykes.co.uk. And also, you can look at Tom's recent book, The Years of Travelling Anxiously. There's a link in the show notes. And lastly, I chatted with James Ward. You can find out more about James in a couple of places. He also has a keen interest and ability in wildlife photography, so jameswardphotography.com, and his safari business is Rewild, so you can look James's tours up there at rewildsafaris.com. Of course, come and chat with us more about these thoughts and what you think in either the Facebook or LinkedIn group for Thoughtful Travellers, and sign up at thoughtfultravel.substack.com to always get the latest news and some, extra food for thought as well. All of these links and more, they'll be in the show notes for this episode. You can find them at notaballerina.com/389. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.